everybody, I'm Alex from Mozaic Works Studios, and today we have a special guest. How can I introduce him? He's a Canadian who speaks Swedish and some Romanian. He's a programmer who speaks about GTD and how to manage your finances. And he's an XP and Agile coach. So everybody welcome JB Rainsberger. Now, I've met JB, I think it was 10 years ago now. Something like that, right?
I don't even remember. It was long enough that I don't remember when. It just seems like I don't remember a time when I didn't know you and Maria and Adi and the folks at Mozaic Works.
Yeah, so we met Joe through a very happy chain of events. First, Corey came in Romania. He was just doing a tour, a pair programming tour and many other things. And then he brought Joe to Romania, and we had an excellent TDD workshop back then with him. And we've had many interactions since then. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. For our audience, can you introduce yourself a little bit outside of what I've just said?
I began professional life as a programmer in the late 90s in IBM, and had a chance to grow up in an environment where it was really easy to learn things. And the worst thing you could do was get fired, but you weren't going to put anybody out of business. So it was a wonderful place to make mistakes and learn. And it was around that time that I started to realize what a terrible programmer I was and that I needed some help. And right around that time, by accident, was when extreme programming was becoming well known, around 1999, 2000. And so I remember putting a copy of Ron Jeffries' article, "We'll Try," up on my office door as sort of my, Martin Luther moment. This was my telling the people around me, we should probably rethink the way we run projects around here. And I made a bunch of mistakes in trying to, spread the ideas of extreme programming around the company around me, which led me eventually to become frustrated and give up. So I left, and in 2001, I started to work for myself with no clue how to find business. But through a nice chain of events, I ended up starting to go to the early extreme programming conferences, which kind of became then the Agile North American Conference. I wrote a book, JUnit Recipes, in 2003 that came out in 2004, and suddenly people knew who I was. And by luck, I just started training people in JUnit and test-driven development, and I became known as that TDD guy in Java. And then I became more and more involved in the Agile community, started helping out with the conference, spent a couple of years on the board of the Agile Alliance, was one of the first two recipients of the Gordon Pask Award that nobody remembers, and sort of cemented my place in the Agile community, but was always one of the old extreme programming guys. I remember that at that time, one of the big jokes was that I was the #2 contributor to the extreme programming, test-driven development, Yahoo groups behind Ron Jeffries. At some point spending 4 to 6 hours a day just arguing and debating and explaining and talking with people on those Yahoo groups as a way of not just learning, but also building my place in the community. And a lot of that has died down, and social media led to sort of fragmenting community in a strange way. So there didn't seem to be one place to go and talk to people about extreme programming or test-driven development anymore. But there's still this sort of neat, loose network of old XP people who, it's like, we know who we are. So when we see each other in the streets, online, at conferences, then we can sort of gather in a small group and talk a little bit about the old days, but also talk about how extreme programming has evolved over the last 25 years, all through the craziness of how the agile landscape, let's say, has changed over the last 20 years. And so these days, when there isn't a global disruption stopping international travel, we spend about 3 months a year in Europe visiting clients on site, going to conferences, doing training, because nobody in Canada will hire me because nobody hires anybody from their own country. And the rest of the year, we live here in Atlantic Canada, mostly relax, eat good food, drink good wine, and try to work remotely with people. Something that seems to be picking up a little bit as things have changed. So I'm still an old XP guy. I think I've gotten over a lot of the early zealotry about, thou must do things this way, thou shalt do this, and so on. And I think I consider myself a much more sort of practically oriented, less dogmatic, agile person, which I imagine is about as rare as a unicorn these days.
It's been very interesting to me in these conversations to see what people think about extreme programming, because extreme programming has been around for a while, but not many programmers know about it, strange enough. And so it's very interesting to see how people got into extreme programming, why did you start writing tests, for example? Why did you go into these communities? How was your experience with these communities?
Yeah, so it really started as simply as I was not doing a great job. I mean, I was one of those programmers that I think my manager and the people around me thought, okay, this kid has some potential. But I found that I kept making too many mistakes. I kept having that experience of, if I wrote code for a month or two, then already it was starting to become difficult for me to even understand on my own. And I mean, I'm not writing in Perl here. This is Java. This should be relatively easy. And so I literally typed into altavista.com, because this was 1999, how to test Java code. And I found this thing called JUnit. I'm like, oh, okay, interesting. And then I flashed back immediately to my failed master's degree. I've done all the coursework for a master's in computer science, but I never wrote my thesis. And at the time, the idea I had for a thesis was something like, formal methods are too strict for programmers to actually use. We need to find ways to approximate the value of a formal methods in a way that industrial programmers will actually do in order to get maybe they can get 60% of the benefits from doing 20% of what it takes to do formal methods. And when I saw JUnit, I thought, this is what I was talking about, like writing automated tests, not just having a discipline around doing debugging or having a discipline around doing manual testing, but writing tests kind of is a little bit like very light formal correctness. It's formal in the sense that you have to write a test and it has to be precise enough that the computer can execute it. But it's nothing nearly as complete or comprehensive as, writing expressions in a formal specification language. So I thought maybe this is something that would work. And so I started playing around with it. It felt like it was helping. And then by accident, I found an early draft of the book Extreme Programming Installed, which was the second extreme programming book, the pink book, for those of you who remember. And, whereas Kent Beck's first book was, here's why you need extreme programming and here's what it's about, the pink book was about, and here's how you get started. And of course, there's a large section in that about how to do test-first programming and why it's important and how it can be helpful. So I tried it. And like any programmer does when you learn something new, you try it a little bit in your spare time, or you try it away from the prying eyes of your manager when your manager can't see the details of what you're doing. And I felt a little bit of early success from it, so I thought this could be useful. And I waited for an opportunity to do it for real. And the opportunity came when a release was coming up, and the code I was writing, I got stuck in that loop of fix one bug, create two more, fix two bugs, create one more. And it kept going like this for a few weeks, and I realized there's no way I'm going to make code freeze. It's just not going to happen. So I was sitting in one of those Friday afternoon status meetings that we used to have every week. And I essentially said to my manager, the bad news is I don't think I'm going to be able to make code freeze. The good news is I've been reading about this thing called test-first programming. The idea is that as I write tests, I'll at least have confidence that whatever code I've written so far still works as I'm adding more code. So this idea of getting stuck, fixing one problem, creating two more should go away. The good news is that sounds great. The bad news is I have no idea how long it would take me to throw all this code away and write it again. So I'll make you a deal. Let me go home and start again. And I know I have 3 weeks before release. I think I can get it done in 3 weeks. And if I can't, if you have to fire me, that's okay. So that's what I did. I went home and I practiced test-first programming for the first time for real in an industrial strength situation where real money was on the line. But I was working on my own on a relatively simple project. It was small enough that I could do it in 3 weeks. And I just worked until I was exhausted, slept, got up again, and worked again. And even though I did not even test-driven development, even though I did test-first programming horribly, like, just barely following the rule of write a test and make it pass, my refactoring was not very disciplined. I wasn't even sure I was refactoring at the time. If I painted myself into a corner, then I just threw a bunch of stuff away, wrote it again, but test first this time. And I managed to get stuff done in 9 days. So then I went back to the office and said, okay, it's done. I don't think there are any bugs in here. We should be able to release it in 6 days. And sure enough, we released it. Nobody ever reported any bugs. And that was my introduction to test-first programming. Literally all I did was follow the rule, write the test first. And I saw the power it had. It felt slow while I was doing it, but I got to the finish line much sooner than normal. And when I got to the finish line, it really felt like I was done. I didn't feel any, I felt like there was almost no risk that I was going to have an unexpected bug. Now, I wasn't a master tester at that point, so I could have just missed stuff. But the problem was small enough and I understood it well enough by then that being able to do it test first really worked. That was what got me hooked. So then I read more of Extreme Programming and installed. I love to remind Ron Jeffries that I've still never bought that book. I've never paid for it, but it's been instrumental in my career. And I went back and read the other Extreme Programming books. At the time, it would have been, Explained and Explored and Planning XP. People seem to forget that there was in fact a planning book on extreme programming. Scrum wasn't the first agile discipline to introduce planning. And I just thought, well, how much of this can I do on my own? I'm not going to be able to influence the people around me at IBM to change the way they plan projects, to change the way they set deadlines. But how much of this can I do on my own? And that became my first my very first user group presentation was, here's test-driven development. And my second one was called XP for One at IBM. Was my experience just trying to do as many of the 12 XP practices as I could, working on my own inside a larger enterprise, but working on a project or a component that I owned myself where I didn't have a team. So it was this interesting mixture of, or I guess lucky mixture, interesting is up to the audience. It was this lucky mixture of working on a component on my own without having teammates to argue with about how we would work, but while still being in the typical enterprise context of me being in a department, being in a business unit, being in a large company. And so there were certainly limits on my freedom, but I could build sort of this warm, dry place, both in the organization and in the code, where I had lots of autonomy and could play around with these XP ideas. And I figured out that I could do test-first programming, which eventually became test-driven development, relentless refactoring, weekly planning, continuous integration, all on my own. And it's the kind of thing that now, if a startup came to me and asked me for advice about how to continue building their software once they've got past the, yes, somebody will buy this stage, that's pretty much what that sort of set of core practices is the kind of thing that I would pitch to them as a starting place. Can you Can you do basic test first programming? Can you do more refactoring? Can you set up continuous build and delivery and integration? And can you plan on a more or less weekly basis? By now, I think it's become quite mainstream now that this is just how people think you should behave. That's startup mode. And that was how I got started in XP. And then, I saw the potential for the bigger way to run projects and how this could affect planning at the department level, at least within IBM. But I had no idea how to influence people. I hadn't read Secrets of Consulting yet. I didn't know any of that stuff. So I had to leave IBM before I could get to the point where I could really do something more significant with these XP ideas. And that, so that was really what made TDD stick with me. And as I got better at refactoring, first programming became test-driven development. Suddenly I began to notice that was a skill on its own. And as a skill on its own, that started to become something that people wanted to learn. I happened to have a 5-year head start on them in gaining experience, and so then it became an income stream. That was sort of the first phase of my career then, was essentially training people on how to do evolutionary design with TDD.
Right. So you mentioned a few interesting things before we go into evolutionary design, which is quite a big topic. How much of an influence was the XP community on you? And the fundamentals for this question comes from a conversation that I had with Jipo Hill, which I think you know. At least he said he knows you.
Oh yeah, we've known each other for close to 20 years now.
And he described a very vibrant XP community where ideas were exchanged and people were discussing and arguing in the best sense of the word, trying to figure out better ways of working and so on. So how much of this have you experienced being in Canada and perhaps?
Well, I mean, so locally, at the time I lived in Toronto. So, when you live in one of the 3 or 4 big cities in a country, you just have more access to people. And I think I missed the first ever Extreme Programming Toronto user group meeting, but otherwise I was a member of the Extreme Programming Toronto user group pretty much from its inception until 2007 when we left Toronto. And so I had a local community it began as a hardcore group of 5 or 6 people and eventually grew to a fairly decent sized group where 30 or 40 people would meet on a regular basis. There would be a formal presentation, there'd be discussions, blah, blah, blah. In those early days, it was literally like a roving gang of 10 people wandering the streets of downtown Toronto, chatting as they were walking along, maybe stopping into a restaurant to have dinner, chatting more over dinner, and then going back into the streets and finding a coffee shop to sit at. It very much had that feeling. And at that time, that was also at the time when I was trying to figure these things out for myself. So these were the days before I was trying to teach this stuff to anyone. And so I had a local community of people that I could get to know. And in fact, the founder of that group, Mike Bowler, was responsible for helping me work on the only extreme programming team I've ever worked on at Toyota. And it was the reason I left IBM. At the same time, I had found, because I was searching for answers, I started by just searching the web. Again, using, Alta Vista and whatever other Yahoo, some of your younger viewers might not be aware of the fact that there were search engines out there that were not called Google in the late 90s. And that was how I found the Yahoo groups, which was essentially an extension of the old, Usenet news groups. And there was a group for extreme programming, and a group for test-driven development, and a group for there was a group for just refactoring. There was a group for just JUnit. Early on, I would go there because I needed answers to questions. This was our Quora Stack Overflow. But you could have real conversations with people. It wasn't just ask a question, get an answer. It was ask a question, 37 people get involved in the conversation, and it lasts 6 weeks. And people are writing 500, 1,000, 2,000 words. And Some of it is deep explanation, some of it is hot debate. It really was the kind of thing that I think Slack and Twitter and Facebook can only give a small, a bad approximation of these days. Like, this was a place where the 150 people in the world who knew about extreme programming and had experience, 90% of them were there and talking to each other. And I very quickly felt comfortable having deeper, difficult discussions, asking hard questions, pushing people. And within about a year or so, I was no longer just asking questions, but also answering them. And so as far as the community involvement goes, it was huge. And then when the first Extreme Programming Conference was announced for 2001, that was an obvious choice for me. By that point, I had spent about a year and a half around these people virtually, and it was clear I need to be involved in this. And so the combination of the local user group, these Yahoo groups, Words Wiki is another one, of course. When I do a training course, I like to ask people if they've heard of Wikipedia, and everybody, of course, laughs and says yes. And then I show them the C2 Wiki and ask them if they've heard of that, and most of them say no, and that's a shame. But that's where Wikipedia came from, right? If we didn't have this Words Wiki, we wouldn't have Wikipedia. And that was where a lot of people got to write about their experience with extreme programming. This group that began as a place to discuss design patterns became the hotbed of, it's like not the Rosetta Stone, but it's like, yeah, it's like the Dead Sea Scrolls of extreme programming and agile software development. These were the early writings by the ancient, wise people that captured our early shared wisdom about extreme programming and other kinds of incremental and iterative approaches to software. So you put the local user group together, Words Wiki, the Yahoo groups, and then eventually the annual conference, and then the XP conference in Europe. And there was this huge community that we were alternating between patiently explaining things to each other and yelling at each other about how wrong we were. And it was, looking back now, I realized that it was an abnormally high trust environment that made most people, most of the time, extremely comfortable to debate with each other in the most positive sense of that term, as you say, arguing in the good way. And I can't imagine that my knowledge, skill, experience in those areas could have accelerated any faster than being in that environment. And so from about 1999 until around 2006, 2007, like, that's the equivalent of being in the punk music scene in London in the 70s, or in being in any of these sort of, in the grunge scene in the northwest of the US in the 90s. You had to be there, and if you were there, it was amazing. And it's no exaggeration to say that I owe easily the last 20 years of my career to being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I'm definitely familiar with that. We had a few happy accidents happening as well. Now, the interesting thing to me is I've been chatting also with Alan Worsbrook and Joe Yoder, who come from basically from the other community, the design patterns community.
Yes.
And the two of them, so we have the PLOP or design patterns community, we have the XP, who kind of come up at the same time, or roughly around the same time.
Yeah.
They are related by Wirt Cunningham, because he was kind
Yes.
of in the center of both. But they also don't always understand each other, in the sense that there were some discussions about emerging architecture. Do we still need architecture?
Right.
The design patterns, people were mostly focused on object-oriented design or architecture and so on. They were, so there was this kind of friction between these two communities, which is a good thing. I mean, but I'm interested in learning if you've seen this in practice in any at any conferences.
Well, so I was just young enough to miss the inception really of the design pattern community. I mean, I when I read design patterns for the first time, I think I read it probably in 1998. So it had already been released for about 4 years. The design patterns community had gone through its initial growth. I missed all that. I was too busy failing to get a master's degree while that was all happening. And so I don't know really how it happened, but what it seemed like from my point of view was that the XP community in particular, because that's where the focus of Agile was at the time, seemed like it was on a mission to try to figure out what was the lightest weight way we could possibly build software. Not because they wanted necessarily to reject the architecture and design patterns discussions of the mid-90s, but because they saw that as potentially heavier weight than it needed to be. And of course, we saw that it wasn't really working, right? People still had that strange notion in their heads that they could just pull design patterns off the shelf, shove them into their code, and it would magically be well designed. And I mean, back then, I'm not even sure that we had a clear conception of what well designed meant. We could sort of feel it. But I know for sure I didn't have a clear picture of what it meant to be well designed, or even just a way of thinking about it until probably 5 or 10 years later. And so I saw the extreme programming focus on emerging architecture and evolutionary design as a way of trying to see where the edge of the cliff was. Like, what design patterns and architecture patterns and analysis patterns are all very useful if we don't try to just pull them off the shelf and shove them into our systems. So where are they useful? And so I think there was this period in the late 90s and early 2000s where we tried to throw all that stuff away, not because we thought it was a bad idea, but because we wanted to see how much of it did we really need. It's kind of the same way that you could rescue a legacy code system by saying, okay, we're going to try to write code that doesn't touch the existing code at all. And at some point, we're going to reach the point where we say that pulling in this little bit of the existing system will be cheaper than rebuilding it, so we'll do it then. I think that was kind of the attitude that they took. And so the downside to that, of course, is that the most zealous TDD evolutionary design practitioners were certainly giving off this appearance like they were rejecting design patterns, like they were rejecting strong architecture, like they were rejecting object-oriented design wisdom. So an innocent bystander couldn't be faulted for interpreting what we were doing as rebellion. But I don't think that's what we were doing. I think what we were doing was trying to figure out what's the least of that wisdom we need to avoid that wisdom from being too directive, to avoid those techniques, to avoid the problem where a naive practitioner looks at those things and says, as most people do when they first encounter these things, okay, well, if I just follow these architecture rules, and if I put lots of composite and chain of responsibility in my code, then it'll magically be well designed. So I know that I spent probably a good 5 years or so rejecting that entirely and trying as hard as I could not to use it until I really needed it. And then around the same time that Josh Garievsky wrote Refactoring to Patterns, like that, the coalescing of 2 or 3 years of the XP community coming to a consensus about how to balance incremental design and design patterns. Josh just happens to be the one who wrote the book. I mean, I don't mean that to diminish what he did, but to more say that somebody was going to write that book. Josh was the one who wrote it. to help crystallize to the innocent bystanders that no, we don't see design patterns as a bad idea. We just think that we think that there's not a balance. I hate that word. There's a blending to be made between incremental design, relentlessly incremental design. You aren't going to need it. Pushing that principle to its limit. Here's where some of the limits are. Here's where design patterns then becomes helpful. That if I'm refactoring code if I'm refactoring code and I don't know where it's going, and then at some point along the way I start to notice that it's moving in the direction of a pattern I recognize, that gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling that I'm moving in a useful direction. It might not be the right direction, but it's probably not a horrible one. And understanding, say, the equivalence between two patterns and being able to refactor between them, the pattern of that then is it doesn't matter which pattern I choose right now. If I choose one and in 2 weeks I don't like my decision, I have a mechanical way of refactoring from one to the other. So I don't have to feel resistance to make the choice. I don't have to sit there, a typical old style waterfall leaning person would sit on their hands until they could figure out how to make the right decision. Whereas those of us who are more comfortable letting things evolve can make an okay decision knowing that we can refactor towards a better decision later. And so I think that's kind of, I could understand why people have a picture of the TDD community as rejecting design patterns and rejecting architecture. And I don't think we did that at all. I think what we did was we said, let's try to live without this as much as we can and figure out the parts of it that we really need in true extreme programming style, in the style of what is the most lightweight thing we could possibly do? How can we defer commitment as long as possible? How can we avoid, how can we be sure that this relatively heavyweight tool is actually going to be helpful for us instead of just signing up to use it and it costs what it costs? And so whatever conflict there might have been between the two communities, I never really participated in that. But looking back now, it's especially interesting to go back and read, say, object-oriented analysis or object-oriented design, and to see the names and the acknowledgements, and to recognize some of them are from the Smalltalk community, some of them are from the XP community, some of them are from the design patterns community, or the RUP community, and to really better understand the overlap. But I think probably the conflicts that they had back then, I'm going to guess that they're not that much different from the conflicts of Scrum versus Kanban versus XP versus Lean of the early to mid 2000s. That, sometimes we forget that we are 97% in agreement, and we focus our energy on the 3% where we disagree, to our detriment, I think.
Yes. It's interesting, before we go into the more technical topics of this. So 2001, we have the Agile Manifesto. We are now 2020. Not many people know about extreme programming. Many people know about Scrum. They have heard about it. They either hate it or tolerate it, more or less.
I think there's the 0.3% who actually find it beneficial, and the rest.
There are a few people I find it beneficial often for teams and for our own teams and so on. But the reality that I see is that few people see it as, I'd love to do that. It's something that I'd really love to do. But anyway, the question is, where did XP go? So why are we here?
So XP in its original form, I think XP in its original form, if you think of it just as here are 12 practices or 13, depending on how you count, Scrum ate most of that because Scrum had a better marketing machine and provided a gentler on-ramp towards becoming agile. I'm not going to argue about how effective it was as a practice. I agree with your assessment, and I don't want to, like, the good about Scrum was that it was easier to get started because there were fewer rules. And the bad thing about Scrum was that it was easier to make whatever you were doing look like Scrum. I mean, we've all seen the, one of the classic, I guess now we would call them memes, where you just take the waterfall, the single pass waterfall that nobody ever did either, scratch out a few words, scratch out requirements and write and scribble user stories, and scratch out design and scribble refactoring, as a way of emphasizing that a lot of the people who tried to adopt Scrum were adopting Scrum as a fashion accessory, and so they were just putting new words on old practices, and not much changed. And that is partly responsible for the number of people who hate Scrum, because what they really hate is naive, feedback-free waterfall with Scrum labels. Now, a handful of people who really were attracted to extreme programming were attracted to it, I think, in part because they treated the practices as etudes, right? So that's the term that comes from music, where finger exercises, say for piano players or organ players, finger exercises are too boring. Etudes are like a mixture between music and finger exercises. So they're finger exercises that are more enjoyable to play, more enjoyable to listen to, therefore more people will do them. And James Shore, again, somebody was going to write this article. James was the one who wrote it, saying the extreme programming practices are etudes. Don't think of them as rules to follow for the rest of your life. Think of them as things to get really good at. And if you get really good at these things, then when it comes time for you to pick and choose which practices are appropriate to a particular environment, you'll be able to just use them in that environment instead of falling into the typical trap of trying to change the way you work and learning how to work the new way while you're hoping to benefit from working the new way. So, if you use the extreme programming practices as more of things to master, fundamental techniques to become good at, you might not do some of them for the rest of your life, but the fact that you've practiced them and got good at them means that when it comes time for you to work in a specific context, you can judge much better which of those techniques are useful in that context, which aren't, and be able to adapt accordingly. The people who approached extreme programming that way turned into, we have the modern Agile community now, which is essentially XP 2020. We have a bunch of people screaming about no frameworks. That's essentially extreme programming applied to itself. We have a bunch of people who moved on to, who are talking about post-Agile, or who were moved into the lean startup community, or now talk about books like design sprints or accelerate. That's essentially XP 2020. One of the things that people complained about the XP community was that we weren't agile about our agile. We were too dogmatic. But that's because as a community, we were largely still practicing. We were largely still mastering the fundamentals. And it wasn't until probably the late 2000s that we had a critical mass of people who had mastered the fundamentals and could then leave those fundamentals behind and do them only when they made sense. And then there was no reason to call that extreme programming anymore, because for 10 years, people had associated the 12 practices with extreme programming. So we used to say in the early days, it was Bill Caputo who said, XP isn't out there, it's in here. Ron Jeffries used to say, XP was how you would behave once you mastered the practices. And I think we see that in things like, as I say, modern Agile, before it was industrial XP. So modern Agile, lean startup, accelerate, all these, Kent Beck and his 3X model is essentially a generalization of extreme programming, whereas extreme programming was sort of what you did when you were exiting the expand phase and entering the extract phase, mixed with a few practices that make more sense during the explore phase. So I think XP has evolved And now we have what I call the dinosaur bird problem. Some people, when they see a bird in the sky, point to it and say bird. And some people, when they point to a bird in the sky, they see a bird in the sky, they point to it and say dinosaur. And they're both right. So there's lots of stuff out there that I look at and say, oh, that's just XP. Here is how XP could have evolved in that direction, where we stopped worrying about quarterly planning, because it doesn't make sense to do quarterly planning for a startup. Or impact mapping, story mapping. These are just refinements of the same techniques that we had in 2001. And whereas Scrum seemed to be more like, we're going to give you the basic framework of relentless iteration, and we're going to tell you to incrementally deliver features, and you have to figure out the rest on your own. Extreme programming said, here are a bunch of things that if you get good at them, Scrum will be easy and beneficial. Now, we didn't say it that way, but looking back, that's kind of like what it was. And something like Kanban method is like Scrum, but stripping down the rules even more. Kanban method is more like, okay, start with just theory of constraints and have respect for people, and then learn what you need to learn. Whereas again, extreme programming is more like, okay, theory of constraints and respect for people, it's in here. If you get good at these 12 things, you're going to find it much easier to do Kanban. You're going to find it much easier to do Scrum. You're going to find it much easier to do Crystal, for the 4 people listening who remember what Crystal was. I think the big difference was just how some people, I guess, prefer the more independent discovery model, and some people prefer the more Shuhari model. And XP definitely fits in the category of the more Shuhari model, where you do these things until it becomes clear that you don't need to do them anymore. So I think that's where extreme programming went. We still carry it around in our hearts. Anybody who likes to learn new things in the Shuhari model will be drawn more to extreme programming. And there's a handful of things out there that people are doing now that are building traction, that have communities building around them, that are birds. And I look at it and I see dinosaur. So I look at modern Agile and I see XP all over the place. I look at Lean Startup. I say, well, Lean Startup is just extreme business development. Obviously. Those things seem obvious to me because of an accident of time and space, because I happened to become interested in these topics at the time that extreme programming was becoming popular for the first time. Or maybe popular is even the wrong word. When extreme programming was going through its early stages, I happened to be there at the right time around the right people. And so I can look at modern Agile and see XP. I can look at Scrum even and see XP. Scrum is an interesting mechanism for discovering XP. It seems like it's not as deterministic a mechanism for discovering XP as we might like. So XP is more directed. Not everybody likes that. But if you know what to sign up for, if you know that you prefer having the steps, having the critical steps scripted for you, you'll probably be drawn to XP. If you have this general feeling like you know the direction you want to go, but you don't know how to get started, go read about extreme programming. It'll give you some ideas about how to get started. Some people love to learn that way and others don't.
So if you are to talk to a 25 years programmer today, would you recommend them to look at XP or some parts of XP? Does it make sense?
Yes, I think just like back then it made sense to read, software development management books from the 80s. In part because there are some good techniques that stand the test of time, right? Test-first programming is not a new idea. It's been around since the 60s, right? The legend says that some of the space race programs used them, or pair programming. They didn't know that that's what they were doing because they just called it programming because they were inventing as they went along. But we know that when Kent Beck wrote about pair programming and test-first programming in the late 90s, he was rediscovering things, not discovering them. So going back and reading that stuff, I think is interesting to see what hasn't changed and what has. In the same way that I, in 1997, read The Psychology of Computer Programming for the first time, which had been written in 1972, and discovered that, yes, some of the code stuff in there was quaint, but the people stuff, by and large, hasn't changed in 25 years, and still hasn't changed now 25 years later. If you look at extreme programming through the lens of these are techniques to practice and master because you'll be able to use them somewhere, if you take a very Karate Kid 1984 approach to it, then I think it can be useful. If you look at it as directions on how to run a project in today's world, some of the advice will probably seem strange to you. But surprisingly little. I think that extreme program, like I'm just running through the practices in my mind, and aside from the obvious issue of co-location, which, you know, we've now had this global 2-month-long experiment with abandoning co-location almost completely and finding out that maybe we were overpaying a bit for a guarantee. I look at something like that and think, well, back then, co-location was important, but what really mattered was high bandwidth communication. And co-location was the only way to get it back then. We can do that more reliably now without being in the same place. However, one of the other things co-location gave us was trust building, not just the effectiveness of the communication. And so looking back now, reading about extreme programming, you might have to think a little bit about sort of what are these practices trying to give me? And maybe there's a better way to do that now. But everyone should have been doing that the whole time anyway. If I could, you know, if I could rant, and I'm not going to rant, but if I could rant about where people failed extreme programming, not where extreme programming failed, but where people failed extreme programming, was they just followed the rules and didn't think about what they were doing, and then were surprised when it didn't help. That doesn't surprise me. The whole thing was designed for you to practice the practices, to become aware of what you're doing, to become aware of how it's changing you, and then to recognize those changes as the point. So it just so happens that now, 25 years later, 20 years later, we might have to have that more upper mind. If you're going to go look and if you're going to go back and read the original extreme programming books now, there's about 20% of those books that will make you turn your head to the side and say, that sounds weird, or make you laugh out loud, or will sound naively quaint, or any of those emotions that you have. Look for what's below. Ask yourself the magic question, if I did that, what would it give me? And ask that question 2 or 3 times until you get to the core of what's under there. And I think you'll find that that hasn't gone away, right? We can reread 5 dysfunctions of a team, and it means exactly the same now as it did when it was first written. And then we can trace that back to Virginia Satir, or the psychology of computer programming, or even psychology from early 20th century. Those things haven't changed. The fact that people are involved in this and that emotions get in the way and we have to navigate that, that was what made co-location so important. Not that if you don't sit together, you can't do XP. Because if you don't sit together, you might never understand the power of living in a high trust environment with strong, efficient communication. However you can build that, you're not going to hurt my feelings if you do it some other way than putting everyone together in a single big office and having them spend 6 hours a day together like that. That's just one way to do it. And that reflects the fact that as programmers, we're very good at focusing on the implementation details and very bad at reverse engineering or extracting the abstraction. I mean, even the name test-first programming is wrong. Test-first is not the point. Even test-driven is not the point. The point is evolutionary design, because we recognize the value of deferring commitment and making decisions easy to reverse and all that kind of stuff. Evolutionary design is what matters. But because we're programmers, we called it test-driven development because we didn't know what else to call it. So we called it by its implementation instead of its intent. And it's taken this long for me, even just in the last few years, to sort of stop pushing test-driven development as the thing, and instead to talk about evolutionary design and say, well, test-driven development is just a good way to do it. Just like trust and strong communication is the thing, sitting together in an open workspace just happens to be a good way to get there when we're not all sequestered in our homes.
Right, so let's go through the more controversial, let's say, aspects of extreme programming. And I will start with an easy one, right? Pair programming. Why should I pay two people to do the same job?
Yeah, and it's amazing to me that, well, no, it's not. So in the very beginning, I approached this idea like, well, what have you got to lose? If you let a handful of well-meaning programmers like me at the time write a bunch of code, you're going to get a bunch of garbage. So I even thought of pair programming in the beginning as an intentional bottleneck. Like, that was one of the first things that occurred to me. This is an intentional bottleneck. I mean, really, part of the idea of pair programming is if you have a negative producer, you want to make them less efficient, not more. And the picture I had of myself was as a negative producer, that I was producing more problems than I was solving. And then when I became more aware of my own practice, even as I became a positive producer, which I like to think I was at least at some point, I started to notice how much of a negative producer people were around me. And so then, of course, you want intentional bottlenecks around the negative producers, and you want to remove bottlenecks around the positive producers, and value should go up. And I honestly cannot explain to you why I understand that and other people don't. Like, it blows my mind that I occasionally say, if you have a negative producer, you want to make them less efficient. And even now, occasionally, I see people who have that mind-blown look on their face. Like, it's one of those things that's obvious when you hear it for the first time, but you might not think about it yourself. So that was part of the reason why pair programming seemed intuitively obvious to me in the beginning. And skipping ahead a little bit, again, the reemergence of mob programming of the last sort of 5 years, I think takes this idea seriously, that we put an intentional bottleneck around the team because we don't want them to produce the wrong stuff. And so here we have the eternal struggle between people on one hand who understand that efficiency can lead to producing bad work which costs more than it's worth. And then on the other hand, the people who understand that the cost of making mistakes dominates the cost of doing work. Therefore, we want to find ways that balance deferring commitment with not shipping mistakes. And so I want to be very clear about this. I don't mean sitting on your hands and thinking carefully for 4 months out of fear of making a mistake. But I think of driving the cost of mistakes so low that you tend not to think of them as mistakes anymore, right? Test-first programming does that. Continuous integration does that. Delivering features to the market sooner in the lean startup style does that, right? That you reduce the investment you make in deciding what to produce so that you can then test how the market responds before you move in the direction of, yeah, the market seems to want this, let's give them more of that. The market doesn't seem to want that, let's not bother trying to produce any more of that. That's what I mean by the cost of mistakes. You know, the book Slack by DeMarco is like 20 years old by now, or at least 15. And it still amazes me that people haven't learned, there's a significant number of people who haven't learned the lessons of that book. And so if you haven't read the book Slack, go, like, pause now, go read it, come back and press play. you get it's the central message is 100% efficiency isn't even good for machines, let alone for people, let alone for knowledge workers. And so pair programming, it seems to me that once you buy the sort of theory of constraints based argument in favor of driving down the cost of mistakes as a way of driving down the risk, then pair programming, mob programming becomes just an obvious thing that people do. And so I've had the experience a few times over the years of having a conversation with somebody and finding out that they already understood this very lean drive down the cost of failure model, but who don't know anything about software development. And then when I describe pair programming to them, they say, well, obviously. So it's totally uncontroversial to them because they already have this idea. Pair programming is really, I'm going to guess that pair programming is really only controversial to people who cling to that cost accounting mindset, who cling to only looking at the cost and not thinking about the flow of value. Forget about the flow of value. Don't even think about profit. Like I remember reading Waltzing with Bears for the first time, and there's a chapter in there called, was it Risk Management is Project Management for Adults? Okay, so they, I'm guessing Tim Lister wrote that chapter title. Because he's a little bit snarkier, I think, than Tom is. And the essence, the thing that really stood out from that chapter, I can still see it on the page, is, here's a typical software project. Cost $7,237,418.27. Value, lots, we hope. And that cost-centered view, I think if you get rid of that cost-centered view, pair programming, mob programming, swarming to one-piece flow of stories, those become utterly uncontroversial ideas. The controversy completely goes away. And I can only imagine that we still have people getting through MBA programs, learning about cost management as the conventional wisdom for how to manage the finances of an enterprise, and they're going to yell at pair programming all day, and I don't blame them for it. It's if so then I want to push a copy of The Goal at them, or of Waltzing with Bears, or any of these books, and say, do you know that there's a value-centered way to think about this that will change the way you think about how to manage your finances? That steers you more in the direction of steady cash flow, and that makes a lot of this stuff make more sense. And if they're young enough or they're open-minded enough, then that message can get through. I mean, I was lucky enough to learn about theory of constraints by around 2005, and so I was still young enough and I was open-minded enough and was leaning in that direction a fair bit. And then finally, here's a theoretical basis for these ideas that made them make sense to me, where I could explain extreme programming not as this magical way of working, but in terms of mathematically reasonable, if not provable, ideas. And I think that just as long as we have people who cling to that cost-centered approach, then those practices are going to remain controversial. Let alone the whole, the fact that it creates some social stress. But then again, I mean, if you can't handle pair programming, you're not going to be able to work as a team. Sorry. And that, you don't have to work as a team, but if you want to work as a team and you can't do pair programming, you can't work as a team. It's just the correlation's too high.
Do you think, I have this nagging feeling that many people, and that includes managers, but it also includes many programmers, they don't quite understand that software development is more like knowledge, is a knowledge work type of thing. So it's not like any other kind of material building things. It's more, much more intuitive, right? When you are building a house, at least you can see it. At least you have an idea about the costs, or it's a whole different thing.
Right. Well, and we've built houses before, right? Construction companies have built houses before.
Yeah.
So they have a track record for what it takes to build a house roughly this big, roughly this style, and they can even specialize in it.
So do you think that's one of the causes, that we don't enough understand or enough learn about what knowledge work actually means and what it means to manage knowledge and not a material kind of project?
It's kind of strange for me because I got out of that way of thinking 20 years ago, right? So I haven't thought, if you say things like the only building that happens in software is when you press the compile button, or that what we do is that everything we do is design. Even writing the code is design. Even typing the code into the computer is design. None of that is building. Or recognizing the not just the limits of, but even the misleading nature of manufacturing or construction as an analogy for building software. That the analogy for building software is more like product design, not manufacturing. It's more like building architecture, not building construction. I've been around that for 20 years. I'm used to it. I'm swimming in that water now. I don't even see it anymore. So I don't know the extent to which those old metaphors are still commonplace. I just literally don't know, because I don't hang around those people enough. Usually by the time, the people that I talk to are programmers who just know, either they know that they need help in building software more effectively, or their managers have said that you need to teach these people how to build software more effectively. I think that sort of as I've stopped going to a lot of these software conferences as a participant, I don't notice the number of people who are maybe coming into the community for the first time, who still think about it as though it were building construction or widget manufacturing, because that's what their professors taught them 15 years prior, because that's what their professors taught them 25 years before that. So I imagine there's still some of that. I would hope that a lot of that has disappeared, but I'm sure it's not gone to zero. So there probably is, a queue of people coming out of school, coming out of large enterprises, being influenced by still Taylorist managers and executives, or Theory X managers and executives, who literally have never been exposed to those ideas. And so I'm sure there's some of that. I just don't see it as much. And I don't know how much of that has to do with things are changing and how much of that has to do with I have successfully isolated myself from most of those people. But I'd say it's still true. I still get a whiff of that. I still get, at least so if I try to pair with a programmer and do some test first programming or do some evolutionary design together, and when I notice they feel uncomfortable, sometimes their lack of comfort comes from being unsure what to do. But some of the time, that discomfort comes from the feeling like they are wasting time, or the feeling like they're going too slow, or the feeling like they are not producing enough. And that definitely reflects the kind of mindset that you're describing. So even if they aren't consciously aware of it, they're certainly subconsciously behaving that way. They're feeling the pressure from their manager, or they're feeling the pressure that they remember from their job 5 years prior or 10 years prior. So it hasn't gone away yet. And as far as I can tell, I don't forget the analogy, but I think it works. It's like they've gone through a trauma, and that trauma is echoing in their mind. And even if they think that they're not consciously reliving the trauma, it's still there. And there aren't a lot of people coming out of school avoiding that trauma. I mean, I use that in sort of the same way that, Dijkstra used to talk about how BASIC was poisoning the minds of young programmers and that they might never recover from it. I mean, in that way. I think that mechanistic construction, the lack of knowledge of new product development, or the lack of knowledge work as design instead of construction, I think that really just comes from the inertia of thinking of it the old way for such a long time. And some of those people still have jobs in schools. And I think we just have to wait for those people to die out before that trauma goes away. So then we end up having to reteach this to people. People have to learn it. And there is a non-trivial portion of our profession who volunteer to learn that stuff, like you, like me. And there's a I think probably still a bigger proportion of that population who are learning it begrudgingly or who are actively avoiding it. And that's probably what causes those ideas to linger, despite the fact that I think we've largely agreed that they don't work. The other point of this, unfortunately, is that the very largest companies in the world got there through a bunch of mechanisms that have nothing to do with how well they produce the thing they sell. And therefore, they have so much slack. This is the irony for me. They have so much slack in cash, in reputation, in market inertia, that they can afford to produce their results with 15% efficiency and still dominate the market. So this was the central question that is still 20 years in the making for me. I think it was Kent Beck I first heard it from Kent Beck. So if we're so smart, why aren't we rich yet? In 2003, he said this. And we ended up, a handful of us went to visit him and do a workshop with him for a weekend to discuss this exact question. Why is it that we have all the right answers, but they have all the money? That seems like some of their money should be coming in our direction. And it's nearly 20 years later, and I find myself having still the same conversations. If I find a handful of agile-minded people, or whatever word you want to use, I prefer lightweight now. If you find a bunch of lightweight operations minded people at a conference, and you have a conversation about how their employers are doing it all wrong and they know what they should be doing instead, and if I ran the show, I would do it this way, but I can't afford the financial risk of a startup. We still ask that question. So then I will literally just say, okay, so what I'm getting from this discussion so far is we have all the good ideas, they have all the money. How can that be true? And everybody looks at each other and doesn't have a good answer. And I think part of the problem is that the kinds of ideas that are involved in how we do our work, how we do knowledge work well, affect us because we're the ones doing the work. We're the ones day to day who have to live it. But in a big enough company, they don't care because it's enough for us to be 12% efficient and they can continue to dominate their market. And because most of how they dominate their market has to do with, ethically questionable financial marketing and sales practices. And part of that has to do with the fact that our economic system is just messed up and rewards the kind of behavior that we don't want to do, that we recognize is not helpful. So you put all that together and we end up looking like hippies, maybe with good reason. But if there were no hippies, then things would never get better.
Right. Very interesting. Going through all this from economy to knowledge work and the
and I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert here, but I can recognize that staunch free market capitalists do not want us to behave the way extreme programming encourages us to behave. Mm-hmm. Right? Extreme programming feels more like small tribal hunter-gatherer society. That's not big industry, right? Yeah. The Industrial Revolution would kill extreme programming, would kill Agile, Scrum, Kanban, even if we all did it perfectly, for whatever that means. The bottom line is that if you try to embed that into, like, that becomes an oasis, a commune within the horrible concrete jungle impersonality of global free market capitalism, even though we don't actually have that. We just have enough of it to be annoying.
On the other hand, there's a case to be made for too much code being written and too many developers writing again and again the same pieces of code. There's if you look at the industry as a whole, there's a whole lot of duplication. Not all of that is for good reasons, because I can understand if you need to develop your core of the business and so on. But on the other hand, you have a bunch of things that you can safely replace with libraries or operating systems or external services or whatever, which
or
have
subsidiaries.
Exactly, which have already been written and are there. So I was thinking about that in the context of software development as a craft, and in the historical context of, craft is no longer with us because all the craftsmen have gone away. They have been replaced with factories and with industrial revolution. And so perhaps and the key to that was having reusable components, replaceable parts, things that you could build, replace, and have kind of a modular system where perhaps you still develop, you still craft a few parts of it, but it's only the minimum necessary for you to get an edge, right? And not, everybody writes a list of users or...
Right. And this is, I think, where, going back to one of your earlier questions, so somebody reading the extreme programming books for the first time now might be surprised by the emphasis on design, because especially in the last 10 years, we've really entered this phase where where we are essentially Yahoo pipes. So we programmers, and I still like to count myself among them, even though I'm not a full-time professional programmer these days. We act more like Yahoo pipes. We are many more of us are mostly integrators in a way that wasn't true 15, 20 years ago. Yes, there was still integration work. I did integration work at IBM, but it was more like there's a core feature that we want to add. In my case, it was, okay, we want to add personalized advertising to our e-commerce platform. Sorry about that. I promise we didn't really go anywhere. Amazon did all the real damage. And there's an engine that we want to use that will provide us, that will be the recommendation engine, but we still need to make the recommendations available on product pages and things like that. So there was still a significant piece that we had to build on our own while integrating a recommendation engine, where all the recommendation engine got was, identifying information in and product recommendations coming out. And the engine didn't know it was recommending products. It just knew that it was doing some neural networky thing. And when your focus is on integration, you can be the world's greatest refactorer, and it doesn't help you nearly as much because you can only control your design up to the integration point, and then after that, you have no control. You might be able to have influence about how they evolve the design of their product over time, but none of that has to do with your refactoring skill, and everything has to do with your people skills, your communication skills, understanding how to influence people, understanding their business model, and trying to find how the changes you want them to make actually match with their business model, and then just make them aware of that compatibility so that they will volunteer to do it. As a programmer, the limit of your design skill and influence is in making the integration surface between you and them as small as possible. And as more and more of what we do as programmers is reduced to integration, the payback of being good at evolutionary design, I think, gets lower. And so here we have kind of this weird, I'm not sure whether paradox is quite the right word, but where practicing evolutionary design becomes helpful because I believe that it's an extremely good way to really learn and deeply understand the principles of writing good software. But that the skills that you learn by doing evolutionary design, you might end up exploiting them in ways that really don't have that much to do with refactoring. So you might learn, for example, I think, well, let me say it more simply. I think evolutionary design has the potential to be a factory for excellent architects. Even if what they get out of it, even if they end up refactoring code 2% of their time for the rest of their career. That I think that it becomes we reach the point where learning that, the act of learning that stuff becomes more important than practicing it. You learn it because it's a little bit like you learn mathematics in grade school or secondary school, not because you're going to do algebra for a career, but because it gives you a window into how to think clearly, how to reason accurately, how to think critically. And I think that evolutionary design, even if maybe we don't have nearly as much freedom to design as we used to, if you learn evolutionary design and practice it well, then the worst case scenario is you become an excellent architect. You figure out why it's better to integrate their implementation instead of their implementation because of the nature of the dependency, or you figure out how to integrate their stuff in a way that balances getting something done with retaining your option to change your decision later, even if most of that is refactoring that goes on in your head instead of on the keyboard. And so I think that's one really significant way in which things have changed for us, that if we're just Yahoo pipes, it can be easy to fall into the trap of thinking that refactoring is not important because I don't write code anymore. I just glue stuff together. But there's a big difference between gluing these things together and gluing those things together, because of once the glue dries, you could be in trouble. And so being aware of those things, yeah, you could learn that stuff without evolutionary design. I tried it and it didn't work for me. It was when I learned evolutionary design, when I practiced test-driven development for 5 years, then I really understood what that stuff meant in a way that just reading books on object-oriented design or just reading, structure and interpretation of computer programs or any of those books might not give you. I think you have to live it for a while, or I shouldn't say that. I had to live it for a while to deeply understand it. I'm guessing I'm not alone. I might even be in the majority.